Francisco, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your patience. As I mentioned, we have on the screen here our friend Francisco Pichon, the UN resident coordinator for Cuba, who's joining us from Havana. Francisco, why don't you make some opening remarks, and then we'll take a few questions.
Very well. Thank you so much, colleagues, for this opportunity to brief you on the situation on the ground in Cuba. It's almost 1 month after the U.S. executive order that has created a fuel blockade for Cuba. The blockade still persists, and its humanitarian consequences are really deepening by the day. What we see on the ground is not a temporary shortage. It is a more systemic energy shock that has become the primary humanitarian risk multiplier. As you know, fuel is not just a commodity. In Cuba today, fuel determines whether hospitals can function, whether water reaches households, whether food is distributed, whether medicines are transported, and so on. As the energy shortages continue, the vulnerabilities are rapidly escalating into a more acute humanitarian risks. So what we find are essential services being scaled back, being disrupted, and daily life for the ordinary people increasingly becoming more fragile. The government introduced a 30-day contingency plan to manage the scarcity of fuel and trying to safeguard essential services. But beyond that short time horizon, the sustainability of these life-saving systems are becoming more uncertain, especially if the current trend persists, if fuel shortages continue. So this is happening in a context where Cuba has been struck by multiple shocks. As you recall, last October we had Hurricane Melissa that affected over 2 million people, destroyed infrastructure. Previously, we had Hurricane Oscar and Rafael in a lapse of 20 days. So the window for recovery has been quite narrow. And at the moment, we are implementing an action plan in response to Hurricane Melissa, which is also being affected, being constrained by the current fuel crisis. So as you also have read, I'm sure, although the US government eliminated the specific tariff mechanisms threatening countries which supply oil to Cuba with tariffs, this as a result of the decision of the Supreme Court on last week. The national emergency declared on January 29 remains in effect, and it's really providing a broader legal framework for additional sanctions to countries that provide oil to Cuba. And Cuba continues, in fact, to be designated as an unusual and extraordinary threat to the US national security. So let me be clear, the risk to people's lives are not rhetorical. And those who suffer first and suffer most are the ordinary people, especially the most vulnerable. And just to give you a sense of the humanitarian risk that are involved. In Cuba, for example, we have 5 million people living with chronic illnesses, which have treatments that are at risk due to the current energy situation. And this includes thousands of cancer patients which require continuous oncology care. We have more than 32,000 pregnant women who are facing additional risk in terms of antenatal services. We have 20,000 newborns every year, which normally require incubators or ventilators, and these are vulnerable to power outages. And so on. I can go on the potential impact that the situation can have unless there is access to fuel. But beyond health, there are also other critical systems that are under stress. Today in Cuba, nearly 1 million people, 10% of the population, get water from tanker trucks. And obviously this is at the moment at risk. The distribution cycles are very dangerously prolonged. More than 84% of the pumping equipment relies on electricity in Cuba. So any kind of prolonged outage directly compromises water access, and it affects households, it affects health centers, schools, processing facilities, shelters. Food security is also deteriorating. And I think the entire supply chain from farm to table is disrupted. And I think despite the efforts of the government to maintain food distribution with available resources, there are obviously disruptions on the sufficiency and the regularity of this aspect. Equally, social protection are also weakening. School meals programs and the elder care centers struggle to prolong services during this energy crisis. And this is older adults are a particularly vulnerable group in Cuba because over 25% of Cuba's population is older than 65. So it's a vulnerable group in the country. And so this is a broader multidimensional humanitarian stress scenario driven by energy scarcity. And as the United Nations, obviously, we are not immune to these constraints. Fuel shortages affect port and airport cargo extraction for humanitarian assistance. Transportation of humanitarian supplies from Havana to other provinces is facing challenges, and in some cases is paralyzed. Import processes are delayed. Freight availability is also decreased. So the UN system in the country and all the UN agencies have been working in jointly assessing the impacts and human needs, and also identifying the potential humanitarian scenarios in very key sectors like health, like water and sanitation, food security, energy, education, logistics. The office of the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has deployed a team to support our coordination efforts on the ground. And as the resident coordinator and the UN country team, we are actively engaged with the humanitarian partners, donors, to really promote a shared understanding of the needs and the humanitarian needs, and mobilize support for critical sectors. Also, at the same time, there is dialogue at the UN regional and global leadership to intensify efforts, diplomatic efforts to really carve out, to support, propose or secure a humanitarian carve out for oil, which is essential for basic services and even to support our humanitarian response. We maintain open channels with the national government counterparts and also other humanitarian actors, including non-governmental organizations. And to finish, the United Nations is a trusted partner with the authorities, and we keep in touch and are engaged with the international community that is present in Cuba and that is prepared to assist on efforts. We already have seen several announcements from the Government of Canada and others who are prepared to support Cuba. But the situation is serious, I think, and it is evolving quite rapidly, and it carries a real, risk for human suffering. The energy shortages are quite prolonged and will not remain as technical problems. They become humanitarian emergencies across a number of sectors, as I have outlined. So the trajectory of this situation requires our attention, the international community attention, our monitoring, and our engagement at various levels to ensure that we can prevent further deterioration. And in many ways, the most effective actions will be the actions that could prevent a humanitarian situation, which will be exceedingly costly to support. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Edie.
Thank you very much, Francesco, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. A couple of follow-up questions. Since the Supreme Court ruling, has there been an attempt by any country to try to deliver oil to Cuba? Secondly, yesterday there was a very serious shooting incident involving an American boat with Cubans and the Cuban military. Have you seen any effects from that on the ground in Cuba?
Francisco answer the two questions, and then I'll come back to you. Go ahead, Francisco.
Okay. Yes. It has been covered in the news that the government of Mexico has intended to deliver oil in addition to the humanitarian aid that has come already, and I think new is on the way. But as the president of Mexico has said, she would like this to be part of a diplomatic effort that is very clear. I think we know of other countries that are prepared to do that, but I think it does require that a humanitarian carve out for oil is negotiated with the United States. And I understand that there are efforts, but I don't really know I don't know the details. But I think it's very important to escalate these efforts because it's the only way to avert a humanitarian crisis of deeper consequences. With regard to the second question, we have not seen any change as we wake up today, but we have seen the reports and the statements concerning the incident of the coast of Cuba. But I think we are not in a position to confirm any details on the incident. I think the Secretary General has always underscored the importance of restraint and in order to prevent any escalation of tensions, and this is very important in a moment like this. There are investigations by the relevant authorities, I think, which are consistent with the international law.
Thank you. Adla?
Hi, Adla Masood with the National. Would you know when are Cuba's oil reserves expected to run out?
Okay. Yes, there has been a lot of speculation on that. As I mentioned, there is a contingency plan that the government issued about 2 weeks ago to safeguard essential services. We assume that this is a plan based on available reserves, and I think it's uncertain what happens after that contingency plan. At the same time, we know that the country does produce some heavy oil, which is supplied for energy generation. But I understand that is limited, and I think the data that we have is that Cuba depends 90% on fossil fuel for energy generation, and that there is a significant deficit of more than 30% of the minimum demand that is required. So the oil that is available locally, that is produced locally, and I think there might be questions about the capacity of the country to refine it in a moment like this, does help maintain electricity generation to a minimum level. It's interesting because as the UN, one of our key priorities is to accelerate the energy transition to renewables in Cuba. And I think significant efforts have been made by the government to accelerate that transition. But at the moment, it's about the proportion of energy that is generated through renewable sources is very small, although the country has very ambitious goals to shift towards renewables. But for a country that is under a blockade for decades, as you may understand, it's very difficult to generate investments that are required for really energy transition. But it's still making progress. It has a strategy, a very ambitious strategy. And as the UN, we are supporting that strategy. And I think bilateral cooperation with China, with Mexico, with many other countries, prioritize supporting Cuba to make it less dependable on fossil fuels.
Thank you. Ephraim, then Benny.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pichon. Ephraim Kosaifi with Arab News. When you say you'd like to see these efforts escalated, can you state more clearly what is it that you expect the international community to do right now, step by step, to address this issue?
Yeah. Well, I'm the resident coordinator in Cuba, so we are on the ground, and our focus is on the humanitarian needs, of course. But our assessment, together with all the agencies that are active in Cuba, is that we have different humanitarian scenarios of response, but they do depend to an important extent on the availability of fuel. And now you have heard some recent news that private actors can import fuel, and I think this is the government has enabled a pathway for that. We've seen some evidence of that, but clearly the this oil is for commercial purposes, perhaps for humanitarian support. But again, our capacities would be very constrained unless there is a humanitarian carve out for oil and aid. And of course, that will depend on a diplomatic effort that can be pursued with the United States. We have escalated that request. I know it's a very difficult moment, but I know that there has been some attempt to make the case for such a humanitarian carve out, which we consider very essential and urgent in this moment where the country still have some reserve and this contingency plan is still ongoing. But I think it's very uncertain after the end of that contingency plan and after the end of this reserve in the country that the crisis could become deeper. But I cannot comment, I cannot give specific details because we as a UN system in the country are not involved in those discussions at that level. But we are aware that there might be going on some dialogue.
Thank you. Benny?
Until very recently, Venezuela supplied most of the fuel for Cuba at subsidized price. How much did the end of that line, what part of the crisis is the ending of that supply?
Well, I think it's the crisis that we are confronting now. I think there is again a lot of speculation on volumes and amounts, but Cuba produced 40%. Sometimes I have heard 45%, 40% of oil that supports some level of energy generation. But right now there is a significant gap. Part of that gap obviously can be met through renewable energy generation, but there is a significant gap in that. Mexico was also providing oil to Cuba, and together with Venezuela, that's how the energy needs were being met. Right now, we have not received, I believe, since January or any additional shipment of oil. So that's why it's so important a diplomatic effort to ensure that humanitarian carve out for oil can be negotiated.
So since January, was that because of the change of regime in Venezuela?
Of course, yes.
Thank you. We'll go online. Islam, Anadolu, Islam.
Yes, thank you. Islam Doğru from Anadolu. Would you please elaborate a little bit about the UN, any aid distribution, especially since this fuel crisis started? Would you be able to do any sort of food or other essentials in the Cuba?
Yes. Well, as I explained in my remarks, the current situation is severely constraining UN capacity to mobilize humanitarian support. We have an action plan in response to Hurricane Melissa, which is a plan that focuses on the most urgent needs and then recovery efforts in 33 municipalities in the eastern region, which is already a very vulnerable area impacted by hurricanes in 2024 as well. And we have an action plan that obviously is suffering impacts in terms of our more limited capacity to mobilize humanitarian supplies from ports and airports to those areas. I wouldn't say the plan is paralyzed, but I think we face serious constraints, and the same constraints will affect also our capacity to respond to the current situation and beyond the contingency plan that the government has announced for 30 days. So the situation in that sense is very uncertain, and again, we come back to the need for oil imports for the country to support humanitarian efforts, but also to maintain essential services.
And if I may just ask and continue, other than fuel crisis, logistic, how is your humanitarian aid budget in Cuba? Do you have any shortage on that as well?
Well, of course, Cuba is excluded from international financial institutions and ODA. We have a cooperation framework for the UN in Cuba. We have a number of partners that support that cooperation framework. The European Union is one of them, Canada, the Green Climate Fund, there are different sources. It's quite diversified financing. But when we have to respond to an emergency, we go out to mobilize resources, and there are different sources that we can access to. Cuba faces inequity in access to funding, even at the time of disaster. But for example, the Central Fund for Emergency Response from OCHA is a very important source of support for Cuba, and most likely we go to that fund to support our response plan. So at the moment, we are discussing with the authorities the options in terms of humanitarian instruments to respond to the current situation. We are engaged also with the partners, and I think it's very important for us for all of us to have a shared understanding of the humanitarian needs and to mobilize support to critical sectors. We hope to do that, as soon as we are able to secure support and the right humanitarian instruments. And obviously, we cannot relax in terms of our response to Hurricane Melissa, which is already a very vulnerable area, and for which we have mobilized resources, not all the resources we wanted, but I think we need to also really keep working in those areas that were already the most vulnerable and are vulnerable also in the face of this fuel crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Close out back with Edie. Go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up, Francesco, on is there a UN humanitarian appeal for Cuba? And if so, how much is it, and how much is funded?
Yes. Well, at the moment, in response to the fuel crisis, there has not been a humanitarian call. I think we hope to discuss very soon with the authorities to see what best instrument we can use given the type of humanitarian situation, which is very different, obviously, from a hurricane or a particular event. But we do have the Hurricane Melissa action plan, which is open, which has an implementation period of 1 year, because it includes the urgent response actions as well as recovery. And that is a plan that we projected to mobilize about $74 million is very severely underfunded. Of those $74 million, we have mobilized around 30%, maybe a little bit more than 30%, and we continue to invest in ensuring that we have additional resources because it's an instrument that is open and that remains very relevant even in the context of the current fuel crisis.
Great. Francisco, thank you very much. All the best to you and the team, and thank you for taking the time. Take care.
Thank you, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.